So this week we're going to touch on several different topics. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a method is, what a class is, what a namespace is, discuss a little bit why the main method is so important. And then we're going to take a look at an if-else selection structure and some conditional operators. So what is a method? A method is just a section of code that has statements that the program executes when the method is called. So a method has a name, and when you put in the code to call the name of the method, the program executes it. The main method has to be in your program because it is kind of hardwired to look for the main method because that is where it starts executing code. So that is required. It's the only method that is required. And so here's the format of the method header, the first line. And then you'll have a opening curly and a closing curly. And then you'll have the statements that it is going to execute. Okay, and so basically void here means that main is not going to return anything, but if you wanted to pass it some arguments, you can, but those arguments are not required. Okay, and really the only time you'd pass it arguments is if you were not running it really inside of C#. That usually happens if you are running it in a console window. And for those of you who don't know what the heck a console window is, let me see if I can, so it's this little thing here. Okay, this is a console window. Your C# code can be run inside there. And so sometimes when you run it here, you'll send it arguments. So another way that you could code main is just like this. Okay, or you can code it this way. Okay, you can do it with or without those arguments. I think a lot of what we do has the arguments there, but they aren't required. Okay. Let's see. What is a class? A class is basically, it's a logical unit, okay? And you can declare data in there. And any data that you put inside a class can be manipulated by the methods that you add to the class. And so the methods are kind of like your verbs, your action verbs. Like you can add to the data, you can modify the data, you can print the data. So anything that you would want to do with the data that you're storing in the class, you would use a class method to do that. Okay, so you can almost look at it as like a little blueprint for the class. And so in its simplest form, you have to use the keyword class and you give it a name. And then you have opening and closing curly braces. And then you would add the code to the class. And you can declare data in there just the same way we declare data in our main method. You can declare it in a class. You can create methods inside the class. And so here is a little example. My class is the name of it. And you can see we have the main method right inside that class. And then we also created another method. Okay, so my class includes the main method and another one called add. And in C#, you will find that almost everything that you use is affiliated with some type of class. The right line method is in the console class. That's why we have to say using system at the top, because that brings in the namespace that includes the console class and the right line method. So you'll find as we progress through the class that we will include other using statements to pull in namespaces if we are planning on using any of the methods that are in classes that are part of the library. So C# comes with a library full of kind of pre-built classes and methods. So as we use those, we have to add using statements. And so it's nice using the library classes and methods because that means you don't have to code everything yourself. And if it's in the library, it means it's tested and it works. Okay, so we will always use library classes and methods whenever possible. So why do we have namespaces? What the heck is a namespace? They kind of came about because of large programming projects um, where a lot of different coders, developers, were working on the same project. And they would have issues because in each of their respective programs, they created variables or classes or methods that had the same name. And so then when they tried to bring everything together, they had what's called a naming collision. They have multiple things with the same names. So to kind of deal with this problem, they started using what's called a namespace. And so a namespace is just kind of a virtual area where the variables and the classes and the methods kind of live while the program is running. And that allows the variables, the methods, the classes to be unique. Okay, and so that is why we have a namespace. Okay, and so I did include a little example here just to try to give you a feel for how naming collisions happened. If you have a developer and they created a class named date, and then you have a different developer who also created a class named date, if you didn't have a namespace, they would be duplicates, right? The class name, even though what the class does might be different, the actual name of the class would be the same, okay? And that would be a problem. And so by placing them in namespaces, we eliminate that issue. Okay, so that's pretty much why we use the namespace. The idea is to give it a unique name, and then all of your classes go inside there. And kind of a side note that you can actually create a namespace inside of a namespace if you wanted to. But we're not going to get into anything quite that complicated in this class. So what is a using statement? Basically, a using statement just allows you to pull in a namespace and make the contents available to your program. And so we will use using statements to pull in namespaces that have our library classes and methods in them. And that brings me to conditional operators and selection structures. So one of the first structures that you work with in any programming language is going to be the if statement. And the if statement checks a condition. So in order to check the condition, you're going to use conditional operators. And so the operators that we use are less than or equal, greater than or equal. And then for equality, to see if one is equal to another, we use two equal signs. Now, the reason we do that is because if we use one, that is an assignment statement, right? If we have just A equals B, it's going to put the contents of B into A. So if you want to check for equality, then you have to do two equal signs. Okay, and then we have not equal. Okay, so I've got two examples here. This first one is checking for equality because we have two equal sign. The second one, it is putting the value 18 into age. Okay, so make sure if you are using an if statement or any of the looping structures that you do two equals because the condition should be checking for something. So for selection structures, there are really three different types that we will be using. There's if else, and switch. We don't get into switch quite yet, but we do get into if and if else right away. So an if statement is a single-sided selection structure because we're only concerned about what we want to do if it's true. So we've got if, and then we have a condition that we're checking. And then if you only want to do one thing, you can put the statement right below it. Okay, a couple things to note. If is lowercase because C# is case sensitive. You've got your test condition. There is no semicolon there. Okay, and then you have the statement that you're going to execute with the semicolon. If you set it up like this, it'll work. Okay, and it's only going to do one thing if it's true. Now, if you want it to do multiple things if it's true, then you have to have curly braces. Okay, and then you put all of the statements kind of one after the other. So this is everything you want it to do if it's true. Okay. So this little example is going to calculate overtime. And so it's only doing one thing if it's true. Okay, so if the hours are greater than 40, we're going to calculate the overtime. And so I don't have curly braces. Okay, and that is how you set it up. Now in C#, it is important that you indent. It's not like Python where you get errors if you don't indent correctly, but in all programming languages, it is considered a standard to indent your code because it makes it readable. Okay, and so we always indent these statements that we're going to execute in an if. The other if structure is called an if else. And with the if else, it's a double-sided selection because you're going to do something if it's true. And then you also want to do something if it's false. Okay. And anytime you're going to do more than one thing, you have to put in the curly braces. So the if section is set up the same as before, where you've got if, lowercase, you've got your test condition in parentheses, no semicolon, and then whatever action you're going to do if it's true, and the action always has a semicolon. Okay. And if there's more than one action, like the example, you put it in curly braces. Okay. Then you have your else, and then you have the action it's going to perform if it's false. Now the else, you'll notice is all lowercase. There is no semicolon there. There's only semicolons on the action statements. And with the else, if you are going to do more than one thing, you have to put that in curly braces. So here's another example. I'm calculating the overtime if hours are greater than 40, and I'm also calculating the total pay. Okay. If the hours are not greater than 40, I'm just calculating total pay. Now, sometimes you will see this, and I actually think this is silly, but you can set up an if else and then do nothing in the else. If you're going to do nothing in the else, you just put a semicolon there. Okay, but to me, that is silly. If you're going to do something like this, just do an if. Don't even put the else in there. Makes no sense. Although you will see people do that. And with the if else, you can create a little more complex structure called a nested if else. So how that works is you have an if and you have a test condition, and whatever you want it to do if it's true, then you have else, but you need it to check for something else. Okay, so you need it to do another check. Okay, so your else is followed by an if and a condition. If that's true, you do the statement else, and you could actually add another if you wanted to. I mean, you can continue with this, but at the end, when there are no more things to check, you would just finish it off with an else, and then the statement, basically, if everything above was false. Okay, and so there's a couple different ways you can write this. You can do it like this, where the if and the else if and the else are all kind of on the left, and then you indent lines from there, or you can nest it all the way across. To the compiler, both methods are equivalent. To be honest, I would use the first syntax just because sometimes the nested if else can get kind of long. And if you start indenting across, sometimes it ends up wrapping, which is kind of messy to read. So that's why I picked the first one. Okay, but the key to using a nested if else is that these conditions are dependent on each other. So you're only going to come down to the second condition if the first one is false. You're only going to come down here to the third one if the first and the second condition are false. So they're all kind of dependent on each other. Okay, so that is a nested if else. Probably would help for you guys to see a little example. And I know there are some examples in upcoming weeks, but I'll go ahead and show you one. So let's just say we have integer grade equals 75. So quite often you'll see this structure for grades. So we can say if the grade is less than or equal to 95, then we can say letter equals, okay, or actually we'll say letter equals 4.0. Else if grade less than or equal, let's see, actually, we'll change this. We'll do it this way. If the grade is greater than or equal to 95, it's a 4 point. If it is greater than or equal to 90, we'll do 90. We'll be generous. We'll do 80. Letter equals 3. Else if grade greater than or equal to 70. Else if grade is greater than or equal to 60. Keeping this as simple as possible. Remembering to put in our semicolons. And then we get down to the last one. And then if we actually want this to run. All right. So this is an example. So we've got grade, we set it to 75. We've got something called letter, or we probably should call it number, but whatever. And we're checking to see if the grade is greater than or equal to 90. Well, it's not, it's 75. So then it's going to come down here. And we're checking to see if the grade is greater than or equal to 80, and it is not. So it's going to come down here. And now we're seeing if the grade is greater than or equal to 70, which it is. And so it sets letter to 2. But you can kind of see how this works. It checks the first one, okay? And if it's true, it's going to do this and it's done. But if it's false, it checks the next one. And then it keeps checking until a condition is true, or, okay, so if, let's say their letter grade was this, okay, it would get all the way down here and it's not greater than or equal to 60. So it would go down to the else and it would set the letter to 0. Okay, so that is an example of a nested if else.